Today, I'm very excited and very honored to be joined by Father Seán ÓLaoire, who's a Catholic priest, an author, an internationally respected spiritual teacher, and was born in Ireland. Seán holds a PhD in transpersonal psychology, and for the last several decades, Father Seán has really devoted his life to exploring the intersection between mysticism, religion, psychology, and all kinds of fascinating topics we're going to dive into today. So through Father Seán's work, which I've really enjoyed personally, I think what he's best at is just helping people rediscover universal truth outside of the dogma of religion. He does a great job at weaving the golden thread of all traditions together and showing you those synchronicities. And so our conversation today is going to be one that I think you're going to really enjoy, which is what in God's name is Christ consciousness. And so without further ado, Father Seán, thank you so much for joining us today on the summit.
A million thanks to you, and I'm really looking forward to it.
And likewise, my friend, you were one of my top guests that I wanted for this summit, particularly because of this topic we're going to dive into today. So I'm just going to go ahead and give you the floor. You can talk for about 30 minutes, and then you and I will do a little Q&A on your topic for today. So
brilliant. A million thanks, Aaron. So I've been recording my dreams since 1979. I was living in Kenya at that stage when I started recording them. And at some stage, I began seeding my dreams. And so seeding dreams is a technique that Carl Jung developed, where you go to sleep at night with an idea that you want input from your higher self. And so I've done that regularly, where as I go to sleep at night, I pose a question to my soul self, and I'm looking for input. So as an example, for instance, at one stage, I asked, what is the purpose of life, or how do you explain life? And the message I got in my dream was that life is a dream that the ego is having, and the ego is a dream that the soul is having, and the soul is a dream that spirit is having, and spirit is a dream that source is having. On another occasion, because I'd heard that it's very, very difficult to define consciousness. Psychologists can't do it, physicists can't do it. So I asked give me the articulation of consciousness. And what I got in my dream was that consciousness is source-saturated self-awareness. Source-saturated self-awareness. It's just God bleeding through into the self. At one stage, I asked, give me a definition of the Holy Spirit. And the definition I got in my dream was that the Holy Spirit is the divine womb in which embryonic Christ consciousness is marinated in the amniotic fluid of pure love. And just 2 or 3 years ago, I asked for a definition of Christ consciousness. And the answer I got in my dream was that Christ consciousness is the permanent awareness of the inner divinity of all beings. And so it's a little bit like the Hindu notion of Namasté, that the divine in me recognizes and honors the divine in you. So it's like the ancient Hindu rishis, they really nailed it. So that Namasté and Christ consciousness for me is about God greeting God. It is God in disguise, recognizing God in disguise. It's like identical twins who are separated by incarnating. Now they're meeting and knowing each other through some kind of psychic soul sensing. And so I want to talk then a little bit about, Christ consciousness and the cohort, because Christ did not come in on his own. This was not a single person mission, I believe. In one of the Gnostic Gospels, it says that there were 3 who always walked with the Lord. And they're the 3 Marys: Mary, his mother, Mary, his sister, and Mary, his companion, or his beloved, Mary of Magdala. Now, I believe that there was a cohort of souls came in, that there was Jesus and Mother Mary at the very center of it, and then the other Marys, John the Baptist, John the Beloved, and then the 12, so there are concentric rings of this cohort, which include all of us, that everybody on the planet right now, in fact, I would say that every being in the cosmos is part of this extraordinary cohort, that we're either closer or further from the center. And I really believe that, that this notion that the angel Gabriel was sent 2,000 years ago to a little country girl called Mary to ask her if she'd agree to be the mother of the Mashiach, that's not true. That both Mother Mary and Jesus had prepared over many, many incarnations in multiple dimensions for this extraordinary event 2,000 years ago. So there were twin souls who went through lots of preparation. Now, I think that all of us make what I call preconception contracts. A preconception contract is an agreement to be part of a cohort group during life on the planet, and we're like a Shakespearean troupe. So, this year we put on Shakespeare, we put on Macbeth, and this next year we put on Hamlet, and next year we put on A Midsummer's Night Dream. So it's the same group of players, but we're playing different characters as we come back each time. And so souls keep reincarnating with a cohort group. But I believe it is improv theater. There's neither a plot nor a script. There's an overarching mission, but we come in and we have to adapt to the situations in which we find ourselves. So as we come in, I believe that we know our own personal history. We know exactly what we've done in previous incarnations. We know what our strengths are and what our weaknesses are. And we know the case histories of everybody else we're going to incarnate with. We know the era in which we're parachuting into. We know the culture of which we're going to become a part. We know the issues we're going to work on. And thereafter, it is improv theater. No script, no plot, everybody just responding from their soul self to the current situations. So I come across this idea sometimes of a kind of this good cop, bad cop idea. This idea somehow that, Herod and Pilate and Judas and Hitler were actually good guys, even necessary guys who volunteered to be the villains in order to stretch the rest of us out of our comfort zone and thus achieve God's plan. I don't believe that for a moment. I think they are simply, like the rest of us, they're players acting in accordance with their own level of spiritual development and thus creating a specific timeline that we call history. So they're not the good guys masquerading as bad guys. They're doing what they're capable of doing, given who they've been in previous incarnations. And the rest of us have to kind of roll with the punches in improv theater. So I asked myself the question then, did Jesus come specifically to be crucified? Did he choose to be crucified? And I don't believe he did. He came on a mission, and his extraordinary spiritual intelligence directed him in every situation to make the necessary loving choices dedicated to the final outcome of the enlightenment of all beings. That was the purpose. The final outcome was the enlightenment of all beings. And so for me, Pilate and Judas were not programmed or even necessary in order for Jesus to fulfill his mission. They simply experienced their own kind of trajectory. And Jesus did what he always came to do, to love compassionately and totally. So I think then a lot about the notion of the cross. What does the cross mean for me? And I have very, very different notions of what the cross represents. So for me, the cross of crucifixion was not just merely a kind of an instrument of torture, but rather that the vertical arm of the cross for me represented the connection between the transcendence of God and the immanence, the ineffability of transcendence meeting the immanence of creation. And the horizontal arm of the cross represented what Native American peoples would call all my relations, the connections between all living beings. And the intersection point is the heart of Jesus. And it is your heart and it is my heart, because we're all suspended on this cross of crucifixion through incarnation. In your heart and in my heart is the meeting place of the transcendence, immanence, and of all my relationships. Now, I think there's a different kind of cross as well, and it's the cross of resurrection. That, the disciples, after Jesus had risen from the dead, are faced with the dilemma. They're trying to persuade people who hadn't met him after his resurrection that he really had risen and that really was he, that it was the same Jesus before and after. But something was different. There was a transformation that occurred because he could come into locked rooms. He could be, some people didn't recognize him initially when he came in. And so I believe then that there's the before-after element, who he was before the resurrection and afterwards. That's the horizontal arm of the cross. And the below-above, the transformation that had definitely taken place because of his death and his resurrection. So for me, that's kind of another version of the cross itself. I looked then at the etheric body of Jesus. When I think about the resurrection of Christ, for me, it is a real event. It's not just a metaphor. So I'm fascinated by the notion of the etheric body. Every single one of us has a physical body, an etheric body, an astral body, a mental body, a psychic body, a soul body, and the cosmic body of God. So I love when I go to the ocean sometimes and I see this bioluminescence in the water, this kind of greeny blue tint that water takes on at night in the ocean. or I see it in fireflies, an inner light that radiates through the physiology of this little creature. I see halos, for saints, representing for me, in some senses, the etheric body of a holy person. And I look at the Shroud of Turin, and I think that, the photons of the cells of Christ's body radiated the cloth with such an extraordinary way, that it imprinted 2,000 years later as visible. Now, we know, in fact, that, emitted infrared radiation from heat emits about 10 to the power of 43 photons every single second. And so for me, it represents the physiological aspect of Christ's consciousness and of resurrection. And when I look at Kirlian photography is the ability to kind of capture the template or the blueprint of a physical object. So you take a leaf and you take a photograph using Kirlian photography, and you get an image of the etheric body of the leaf. And if you cut a piece off the physical leaf and photograph it again, the etheric body is still in place for several moments until it dissolves. And the same thing happens to us on death. Then when we die, the physical body begins to disintegrate first, but the etheric body hangs around for several days, and then it begins to dissolve as well. And so I came up then with my own version of, I'm going to call it my theory of creation. And this happened 3 or 4 years ago in a powerful vision I had. So it was the realization that, before there was time, only God existed. So science talks about space, time, energy, and matter. There was neither time, space, energy, nor matter. There was only God. The problem is, if there is only God, no experiences are possible. If there is nothing with which to relate, then you can't generate experiences. So God self-fractured into millions of holographic fractals, what the Kabbalah will call netzotzot, sparks of the divine fire. Now, a hologram is an entity that contains the totality of itself in every one of its component parts. And a fractal is an image that repeats at an infinite number of scales. So, every single one of us is a holographic fractal of God. We contain the totality of the divine in ourselves, but it's hidden in some ways. We're fractals, we're kind of tiny images of what God looks like. Now, I believe in this vision, what I saw was that God called the first synod of all these netzotzot, these souls. And they decided on a project. And the project was to co-create a cosmos. And we co-created a cosmos with galaxies and stars and planets and moons. And we were in awe. We're fascinated witnesses of what we've co-created with God. And there's a word for that in Buddhism. They call it turiya. Turiya is the ability to be in a witnessing stance. And then at some stage, God called a second synod. And we said, if we can go even deeper than this, what if we were to become part of the cosmos so that, we could set up finite avatars? We who are eternal beings, could we set up finite avatars in order to experience the cosmos from the inside out? And we did that. We created these avatars that we call our spacesuits or our bodies. And so we really got into planning a whole range of dimensions, all the way from 10-dimensional entities who are pure love and light and laughter, all the way down to 3-dimensional beings like planets and human beings. Now, I believe that the higher dimension, there's less separation from source. The lower dimensions experience a greater separation from source, 3D humans, for instance. So then incarnation is actually a game to promote personal and planetary and cosmic evolution, in which we have agreed to experience the constraints of living in a 3D world. And Christ took the ultimate dive into density, where we read that while he was in the tomb, the 3 days he spent in the tomb, that he descended into hell, that he visited not just 3D density, he went literally into the pits, the ultimate density, where souls are trapped in fear and confusion in order to bring light back into that realm. So that was the ultimate. Now, I think, we volunteered to accept a whole set of rules when we come into 3D reality, limitations, and that is the idea of time and space, and IQ level and amnesia. All of us are subject to these. We who are cosmic beings now find ourselves shrunken into these little 150-pound spacesuits. We who had cosmic intelligence are now operating with a tiny little laptop between our ears. We who are outside of time are now stuck in time because our brain isn't intelligent enough to grok the entire gestalt. So we have to break it up into bite-sized pieces and process it sequentially, giving rise to the illusion of time. And ultimately, there's amnesia for who we are and why we've come and where home is. Now, I believe that during this process of volunteering for 3D density, all of our cosmic co-creators are really deeply grateful to us. You know, Christ said famously one time, there is no greater love than to lay down one's life for one's friends. Now, I actually disagree with him here. I think there are 3 levels here. The first level is the courage, you know, to lay down my life for my friend, to die on behalf of my friend. That's an extraordinary level of compassion and love. But there are 2 places beyond that. The second one is to take up one's life, to agree to incarnate, you know. So that's a greater form of love. And Paul will say this very beautifully in his letter to the Philippians, where he says, have that same mindset in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. Because although he was God, he did not cling to his divinity, but he emptied himself, taking the form of a slave. And being found in human form, he humbled himself even further to accepting death on a cross. So that's the second level. To take up life, to choose to incarnate is even greater than to choose to die for a friend. And the ultimate one is to take the bodhisattva vow, to choose to reincarnate again and again and again until all sentient beings awaken. That for me is the ultimate form of love. Now, I believe, you know, that Christ consciousness is ultimately tied up with the process of evolution. And years ago, I had an encounter. There's a river that runs through my property. I live in the middle of the forest, and there's a river called Pina Creek. And I go down there every day with my dog. And in December of 2012, I was down there, and there was a man sitting on the riverbank. I have never in my life seen another human being down there. It's right in the middle of the forest. And this guy looked like a hillbilly from Ohio. He was sitting on the banks of the river with his legs dangling in the water, and he was chewing on a blade of grass. So I go down, I take off my shoes, I sit beside him, I dangle my feet in the water, I grab a piece of grass, and I'm chewing at it as well. And in my mind, I think, I wonder, is he going to tell me a story? And he turned to me and he said aloud, yes, I will tell you a story. He said, I am a being who travels worlds and galaxies, and my job with others is to seed life on various planets. And we seed the life, we water it, we fertilize it, you know, we weed it, you know, we come around, we genetically modify it, you know, and we can predict very accurately how life forms are going to develop on any planet until we introduce free will into the equation. And once we introduce free will, all bets are off. We cannot predict how it's going to proceed from then. And he said, I'm telling you at this stage that your planet, Earth, is at a trifurcation point. It's splitting into 3 parts going forward. And he called the 3 parts, he said the first part is Homo sociopathicus. These are the oligarchy who see the planet and the people as simply resources for themselves. And the second group he called Homo artificialis. These are cyborgs who are being created in a transhumanist agenda to serve the needs of Homo sociopathicus. And the third group he called Homo spiritualis. And these are people who are awakening to Christ consciousness. Now, since that time, I've kind of refined the model a little bit further. So when I think of Homo spiritualis now, I think Homo spiritualis are people who make occasional forays into Christ consciousness. There's a level beyond Homo spiritualis. I call it Homo mysticus. And Homo mysticus are those who make regular forays into Christ consciousness. And then the level beyond that is Homo Christus. And these are people who are living continuously in Christ consciousness. And then ultimately, there's Homo Deus, the end game of Lila, where, you know, all the waves return to the ocean. So let me finish up then with this consideration. I see this tug-o-war between fundamentalism and mysticism. I believe that religion is merely the training wheels for spirituality. That, you know, once you've developed mystical spirituality, you don't need religion anymore. But religion tries to hold on to us and to dominate us. And it does this often through a kind of a regression into fundamentalism. And fundamentalism for me is the antithesis of mysticism. You know, I see fundamentalism of all stripes, whether it's economic or political or kind of educational or religious. It goes through 4 stages, always. And I've seen this every place I've lived in the world. The first step is you reduce a very complex idea to a one-liner bumper sticker. You think you can understand God by putting a bumper sticker, you know, on your car. So you reduce very complex ideas to simple one-liners. That's the first step always in fundamentalism. The second step is you either identify an enemy or you fabricate an enemy. The third stage is you dehumanize the enemy. And the fourth stage is the slaughter begins. Now you begin killing the dehumanized enemy. I see that happen again and again throughout human history and all the places in the world that I've lived. Now, mysticism does exactly the opposite. Mysticism moves from cataphatic to apophatic language, to the language of theology into the language of mysticism. Cataphatic language is the language that attempts to tell you what God had for breakfast. Apophatic language is the neti of Hinduism. X, no, God is not X. Y, no, God is not Y. Z, God is not Z. It is kind of the Zoa, the Kwans of Buddhism. Yeah, what is the sound of one hand clapping? Or what did your original face look like before your grandparents were born? So you move from cataphatic language theology to apophatic language of mysticism. The third stage is that instead of an enemy, dehumanizing, identifying an enemy, you realize that all people are your neighbor. And the third stage is instead of dehumanizing, you offer Namasté. You recognize the Christ consciousness in everything. And then finally, you reach out in unconditional love. So I'm going to leave it at that and open it up because there's a whole much more I want to say, but I'm Irish, I'll keep going forever. So let's open it up here and see where you want to take it.
All right, brother. Thank you so much. That was a juicy meatball you just served us up there.
Okay.
A lot of deep topics that I'd love to slice into. And obviously we don't have more than about an hour together, but I'm curious, have you put all of these systems and philosophies you just explained into a book yet?
Okay. Not quite. I do it. I have a community, a spiritual community. I do homilies every week. So I have about maybe 700 different lectures and homilies that I've given over the years. So all that material is contained there. And just very recently, some friends of mine have been kind of creating transcripts from it so that I can identify some themes and maybe kind of work on another book. But honestly, I found that meeting people like you and doing podcasts is a much faster way of disseminating these kinds of messages. The last book I wrote, I think it maybe sold 5,000 copies, something like that. So I do a kind of a podcast with Aubrey Marcus, and it gets 250,000 hits. And so it's like, for me, I'm much more interested in talking to guys like you, and getting the message out that way.
Yeah, it's definitely more fun too, right, than spending hours on your laptop writing a book.
Right.
Well, okay, then I look forward to you putting those, just kind of your whole cosmology into a book form, because, I mean, again, I've read Setting God Free, which goes into a lot of what you just touched on. Right. But I think almost as like a mystical Christian cosmology, that so many of the things you laid out are just so fascinating. And there were so many things I jotted down I wanted to ask you about. So I guess I'll just kind of throw some questions out and see what sticks and where you want to go with it.
Sure.
But
sure.
I loved, first of all, I've never heard this idea, but I absolutely love it, that Yeshua, the soul of Yeshua, did not just incarnate alone, but incarnated with a cohort of souls who came to perform improv theater, as you said, with an improvised script. Now, there's a different channeled works, whether it's Edgar Cayce or the Law of One, who say that the soul of Yeshua chose the path of martyrdom in his incarnation. Whether he knew it would be the cross or not, who knows? But that's kind of been the traditional mystical view of Jesus as a soul, is that he kind of chose to play this role. But you said that you actually think he didn't choose to, I think you said go to the cross, or be a martyr, something like that. So I'd love to hear your take on, what do you think the overall goal was for Yeshua's soul coming into his incarnation?
Right. I think the overall goal is the waking up of every person to the realization that we're all, bite-sized pieces of God. And so if we're bite-sized pieces of God, it must mean that the only response to any situation is love. So one of my mantras for myself when I'm going to sleep at night is, there is only God, there is only love. Everything else is mishigas. There is only God, there is only love. But we've been kind of diverted, kind of led astray. So that was his ultimate task, is to kind of wake up people to the realization that only God exists and only love is real. So now, how do you demonstrate love in a variety of human circumstances? And so I think in different lifetimes, he found himself in different, or he agreed to different kinds of incarnations to represent different life trajectories and how you would remember that you're God and how you would love, respond in compassion and love in those circumstances. So when he came for the life of the carpenter in Nazareth, he knew that he's parachuting into a time and a place, the Roman occupied land of Israel at the time, realizing that any popular movement is immediately going to draw the ire of the Roman Empire. And that given his message and given the fact that he was empowering the individual people, because he was putting them in contact with their own divinity, because he would say stuff like, the same things I do, you will do, and even greater. Or he would say, I am in the Father, and you are in me, and the Father is in you. So he was not claiming an exceptional status. He was only saying, when you really understand this and you live from that place, this too is possible for you. He did not come as something to be worshipped and adored, but something to be imitated. He would approach them and saying, this is what it's about. Now, he knew that parachuting into this culture at this stage with this message, it was almost inevitable he was going to wind up dead. And the method of execution was the cross at that stage. So he knew there's very good chances that it's going to wind up, with crucifixion. But he's not signing up for crucifixion. He's signing up for a mission at a time and a place where it seems it's going to be really, it's an 80% chance that this will be the outcome of it. But what he wanted to demonstrate then is not only is it, can you live this life of love and compassion and forgiveness, when you're healing the sick or you're breaking bread with people, but when you're being tortured and crucified and spit upon and hated, you can still respond with love there. You can pray for the soldiers who are crucifying you and shredding your garments, you can pray for those. So he's not just telling us, how you can live in love. He's showing us how you can die in love as well. So that every facet of his 33 years in that particular incarnation was a demonstration of what is it like when you realize that you're a divine being in human form, whose only response to any situation is compassion and love. That was the objective, I think. Yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah, very much in line with you there. And as a Catholic priest yourself, I'd love to hear your take on this. As a Christian growing up, as an evangelical, as a pastor's son and all that, I would always kind of deride the image of Jesus on the cross, the Catholic Jesus, sickly, distorted, bleeding, dying on the cross. And I go, come on, he's not up there anymore. He is risen.
Yes.
I'd go to the evangelical message, right? Was what I like to emphasize. But as I got older and left organized Christianity at 23 and went on my own spiritual path, I came back to that Catholic image with a very different perception, which is much more in acceptance of it, of like, actually, that is, I think, the best possible image of Jesus. Because to your point, Father Seán, on the cross, we see Jesus displayed what I believe is the ultimate act of enlightenment, which was to go through this torturous death ceremony with love and forgiveness in his heart. And so it's like, he should be up there. That's the whole point, is that he did it. He showed us what's possible. And we're used to images of the Buddha, kind of like I have here with Yeshua, meditating and radiating, divine light and looking very peaceful. And it's sort of like, okay, great. Like lots of people could probably look very enlightened in a nice lotus meditation under a Bodhi tree when it's all fine and well.
Right.
But can you still radiate that energy when you're dying on the cross?
Yes.
That's a bit of a different game. And Jesus went to play that game and played it very well and showed us, yes, you can have love in your heart at all times, no matter what is happening, even when, Jesus is on the cross and forgiving his murderers while they're murdering him. Yeah. And so I very much have come to love and appreciate the Catholic imagery of Jesus on the cross because of all of its mystical symbolism. And so I'm curious if that's one of the reasons you were drawn to Catholicism yourself.
That's you've articulated it beautifully, Aaron. And so you're absolutely right, because when you think about it, throughout human history, there have been literally billions of human beings who have been crucified in some way, not just literally nailed to a piece of wood, but that their life circumstances have been so horrific, that what they needed desperately was not a Buddha figure sitting under a tree, blissing out. What they need was somebody who's experiencing what we're experiencing and is still responding in love and compassion for others. So, there's hope that it is possible. so that Christ is not some kind of a totally distant character who represents a spirituality which is totally unattainable in circumstances of kind of surrounded by bliss and protection, but that in the midst of the most horrific system of execution ever devised by human beings, that this man was so in touch with the source that he could be filled with love and compassion and forgiveness even then. And that billions of people throughout human history who've been in all kinds of circumstances, women who were being raped, babies who were being butchered, that somehow the realization, here was somebody who experienced what we've experienced, even worse, and he still responded with love. And so that image of a crucified Christ was hugely important to billions of fellow sufferers on the planet, in a way in which the glorified Christ was so totally out of touch and unattainable that, it was a distant kind of just an object of veneration, but that was it.
Yeah. I mean, I've had personal experience of what you're describing, talking about all these different human tragedies that people have gone through and go through every day. I've experienced that twice with the crucified Jesus coming into my awareness at my lowest moments, just kind of out of the blue. But one of them was when I was in Mexico on a missions trip and I got Montezuma's revenge. Oh, God. And I was just in a really bad spot physically, thought I was going to die. And all of a sudden I just felt, the crucified Jesus hanging on the cross right next to me saying, "I'm with you, brother. Like, we're going to get through this." Wow. And I just clung to that cross, man. But the second time it happened was in my first ayahuasca ceremony. Okay. I went into this really deep darkness and I was moving some serious traumas and things like that. And it just felt like I was surrounded by demons in every direction for miles, just nothing but pure evil and darkness, and physical body was totally overwhelmed. I couldn't control my body. I was kind of like slumped over like this, unconscious. And it was really the most terrifying experience I've ever had. No control at all over anything. And the only thing that was left in my consciousness to do to save myself was to remember that someone else has been in this kind of darkness, which is my greatest inspiration of my life, Yeshua. Yeah. And so I just kind of felt acquainted with the sufferings of Christ, as Paul would say. And it was the light that pierced through the darkness that allowed me to have hope of, I can get through this because Christ is with me. Christ is in me. Yeah. And so I see Christ that way, very much as you described, that the Christ is more than just the person of Yeshua, but Yeshua simply realized and embodied this divine principle. And I know that you, Father Seán, similar to me, are very much a spiritual philosopher at heart. And I enjoy listening to you because you weave in so many philosophical systems like metaphysics, ontology, and cosmology into your teachings. And so I love the way that you describe the Christ from those perspectives, because to me, I fully agree that Christ is sort of this teleological man, like the final cause, the thing we're all evolving towards. Yes. So I'd love for you to say a little bit more about that, as Christ sort of being that divine idea in the mind of God to which all human beings, whether they know it or not, are evolving in that direction.
That's beautiful, beautiful. And you put your finger on it with the term teleological, because it's a term that a lot of people misunderstand. So when Christ says, for instance, you must be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. Now, the New Testament is written in Greek, but Jesus was speaking Aramaic. But the term that Jesus uses, which is translated as perfect, is telos, from which we get teleology. And we think telos, perfection, means stainless steel sinlessness. And that's not what it means. It's from teleology. It means to be attracted toward a goal. So perfection does not consist in a stainless steel sinlessness. It consists in the radical kind of commitment to the mission for which I incarnated this time around. No matter how many times I fall in my tush, I'm going to pick myself up again. So for me, the archetype par excellence is the little acorn. When an acorn falls from a tree, no matter what kind of surface it finds itself on, it's going to attempt to send down a root. And it's going to take an acorn 50 years to become an oak tree capable of dropping its own acorns. But it's committed to the process, no matter what environment it finds itself in. So that's what perfection is. It's not a stainless steel sinlessness. It's the teleology of being attracted toward a goal. And you've nailed it. It's precisely, the realization that there is only God, and that we volunteer to generate experiences on behalf of God. That our origin, our journey, and our destination is God and His love. And to hold that image, we need some kind of exemplars. And I don't know of any exemplar who did it better than Jesus of Nazareth. Yeah. There's this extraordinary that at every phase of his life, in every single circumstance, come hell or high water, he could harvest every situation. So there's this beautiful parable he tells. He's the master of paradox, in his parables. He tells this great parable. He says, here, the kingdom of God is like this. There was once a very rich man who had a steward whom he placed over all his property. And then after a few years, he found out that the steward was embezzling his property. So he calls him in. He says, I need to see the books. I hear you've been embezzling my property. And the steward thinks, holy God, what am I going to do now? I'm too old to kind of get a real job. I'm too embarrassed to beg. So he starts calling in all his master's debtors. And he says, Seán, how much do you owe my master? And Seán says, 100 bushels of wheat. Right, here's your bill. Change it to 80. Aaron, how much do you owe my master? 50 barrels of wine. Here's your bill. Make it 30. And then Christ says a very strange thing. He said, the master praised the unjust steward insofar as he had acted wisely, because the children of this generation are wiser to their kind than the children of light. Now, did he mean that the master was praising the steward's duplicity? Absolutely not. He was saying, here was a guy who could turn every single situation to his own economic advantage. When he was a steward, he was embezzling. But even when he got fired, he was using bakshishi, bribe, to get some money. So Christ says, why can't you do that? There is no circumstance or situation or relationship that you cannot harvest for your own spiritual evolution. Every situation is pregnant with the possibility of giving birth to God. And that's the whole objective. The whole mission of planet Earth is to give birth to God. Now we give birth first to an ego, and then to a profession, and then to relationships. We're not done giving birth until we give birth to God. That's the whole object of the exercise, to give birth to God. It wasn't only Mary who was asked to do that. It's every soul who volunteered for incarnation. And that's the teleology. How do I know when I'm finished? When I've given birth to God.
Wow. Yeah. I love that interpretation of that parable. Yeah. You said Jesus, in your mind, you don't know anyone who has set a better example than Jesus. I totally agree with that statement. It's something I sometimes will say as well, that, maybe the Buddha could have done it.
Right.
Maybe Krishna could have done it. Maybe Lao Tzu could have done it. I don't know. Going through the cross and that whole experience the way Jesus did. Maybe other sages could have done it. But the fact is, we'll never know.
Yes.
We only have the example of Jesus to go off of, and we know that at least one man we know did it. And that's why I find Jesus to be endlessly inspiring. And so I'd like to also ask you about, you brought up the kingdom of heaven in that parable. Are you familiar with, or have you read A Course in Miracles?
I know about it. I've never read it, unfortunately. I know the kind of the history of it, how it came into being. I have tremendous admiration for any phrases I've seen, but I've never actually read it.
Okay. Well, as somebody who has a PhD in transpersonal psychology, I think you would absolutely love it.
Interesting.
In combination with your kind of mystical Christian background, because as you probably know, the course is written, it's purported to have been channeled by Jesus. Yeah. And it's written with that gospel sounding language where it's using terms like the Christ, Holy Spirit, atonement, etc. But it's all mystical. Okay. And so the words are pointing beyond themselves, right? Yeah. So it's just the most incredible text, I think, ever channeled for many, many reasons. But it just has these very beautiful, succinct ways of putting these truths into words that we're talking about. And one of the phrases I love so much from ACIM, it says, the kingdom of heaven is the awareness of perfect oneness and the knowledge that there is nothing else. And a lot of people like that definition, but they'll only repeat the first part. The kingdom of heaven is the awareness of perfect oneness. And then they'll leave out, and the knowledge that there is nothing else. And that, to me, that makes a huge difference to add that second part in.
Beautiful.
So I'd love to hear kind of your thoughts on that definition.
That's interesting. So I've been very privileged in the sense that I worked as a missionary for 14 years in Kenya before I got thrown out by the government for work I was doing in social justice. But I had the privilege of, in some instances, being the first person to speak to a group of people who had never heard of Jesus. It's an extraordinary privilege.
Wow.
To meet a group
what a
of people,
treat.
Yeah, where you're the first person to talk about this carpenter from Nazareth, and the kingdom of heaven. And speaking in Swahili, people would ask me, what does the kingdom of heaven mean? Where do we have to go in order to meet this dude or whatever? And speaking in Swahili, I made up a statement. I would say to them, Mbinguni si mahali bali ni hali. And you can hear the alliteration. I did it on purpose. Mbinguni si mahali bali ni hali, which translates as heaven is not a place, it's a state of consciousness. So I'm trying to tell them it's not a geographical location. You're not going to get there by going to Nairobi and hanging a left. It's a change of state of consciousness. So this realization again that the kingdom of heaven, literally, there is only love. There is nothing in the kingdom but love. That's what it means. So that everything else, is a kind of, it's a seduction. So when I think about Christ consciousness, it's the permanent awareness of the divinity in all other beings, and ipso facto the realization that there is only the kingdom of heaven. There is nothing else. Everything else is a kind of a misstep on the road of incarnation. So for me, the kingdom, again and again and again, I said to myself, there is only God, there is only love. Everything else is mishigas. Yeah.
Yeah, beautiful. Wonderfully said. The other thing that it brings up as you're talking about this on the philosophy side is the whole concept of privation.
Yes.
That evil does not exist. As you say, there is only truth, there is only the kingdom, but are you aware of it or not?
Yes.
And Jesus seems, even in the canonical gospels, right? Jesus seems to be saying this, that the kingdom of heaven, no one will say, here it is, there it is, oh, it's on its way. For I tell you the truth, the kingdom of heaven is within you.
Right.
And in Thomas, as you probably know, he says, the kingdom of heaven is outside of you and inside of you. And he says, it's already spread out across the earth, but men are unaware of it. So it seems like Jesus very much had that definition that we're describing here of it's a level of awareness you have to gradually integrate because the ego mind is built on sin and separation and judgment. And when I started reading the course about a decade or so ago, it would emphasize this idea that evil does not exist. Sin is unreal. Sin is an illusion, these kind of things. And at first, like most people, it would offend me, right? Oh, are you saying that all the bad things that happen in the world aren't really happening? And it took me some time to understand what it really means to say that evil doesn't exist. But it wasn't until studying Greek philosophy, and especially Aristotle and Plotinus, who talked about privation theory, that evil is an absence rather than a presence. It is the lack of something rather than the presence of something. And so that's why we can say it doesn't actually exist. It doesn't have its own separate ontology apart from good. And so can you, being someone who has such a rich background and education in philosophy, can you say more about that for the audience, just why it's important, I think, for people to understand this idea?
So one of the things I got in a dream some years ago as well, I wanted a definition, I wanted a distinction between sin and evil. So I'll say that piece first and then I can respond specifically to what you're addressing. So in this dream, what I heard was that sin is the individual transgression of a culturally created precept. It's breaking a human law. Whereas evil is a cosmic conspiracy using human intermediaries to separate souls from source. So in that sense, there's a huge distinction between just man-made precepts, like that you can't eat meat on a Friday, or you're going to go to hell if you're a Catholic, on the one hand, and this choice for kind of selfishness on the other. So for me, all selfishness is an attempt at self-love. All evil is an attempt at self-love. So with Plotinus and Aristotle, I would agree completely that it's not even the absence of love, that evil is not the absence of it, it's the misdirection of it, that the object of love is wrongly placed, so that we're looking for love in the wrong places, but we're all seeking love. Hitler is seeking love in some way. Every murderer, is doing it because he thinks for some reason there's a benefit to be accrued from doing it. So it's a form of self-love. So every action is based on some form of love. Except, unfortunately, the law of one talks about this movement from service to self to service to other. And I love that distinction that every little baby is born at this end of the spectrum. Every little baby is a narcissist because, it needs milk and it needs mother and it needs cuddling and voices. So totally self-engrossed, and that's appropriate. But we're supposed to move along the spectrum until we get to the 51% place, the Mother Teresa of the world, and it's service to others. But it's all love-based. The child is seeking love. The child is being driven by love, the need for a breast and for milk and cuddling. So it's love. So selfish acts, are all based on a need for love. But it's the misinterpretation of what love is. And so in that sense, then, that I think that the deprivation, evil is not kind of the presence of actually dark stuff. is the kind of the realization to fail to see the light in the darkness. That I differentiate between the concept of nothingness and the concept of no-thingness. Nothingness is a complete void, absent everything. No-thingness means that there are no discrete entities in the womb which has the potentiality of gestating and giving birth to everything. So for me, no-thingness is simply that I can't point to discrete objects and say, that's missing in here. But that rather it's the fertile, fecund womb capable of giving birth to anything. And in that sense, then that darkness is actually the kind of the womb in which love is going to be kind of manifested. So when I get that, then I have a different understanding of evil people or evil actions. That is a terrible attempt, a misguided attempt to generate some kind of self-love. And that the real test of love is what the direction of it is. Any love that's directed at me inevitably is going to become selfish and dark and envious and angry, and even kind of violent at some stage. All love directed outwards is going to recognize the divine in others. And if I sit in the middle of my forest and I'm looking out my window and I'm surrounded by trees, and there are bunny rabbits outside, and there's snakes out there and antelope out there, and realizing that everything is an articulation of God. And so they're divine in some way. Only their level of self-awareness is different. The avatar and the rock, are both creations of God, but they have different levels of self-awareness. So the question is, if I have a million ways to focus my love outside of myself, it's very, very different than having one way of focusing on love for myself. So it's like, instead of sitting down to a feast of many, many dishes, I insist on eating the same stuff every day, the same one meal every day, self-love. And that creates all the kind of the darkness in my world. So in that sense, I would say there is no such as evil per se. It is the pursuit of love, misguided by a total focus on self-love rather than love of others.
Yeah. Yeah, well said. I mean, even to your point on the two polarities from the law of one, service to others, service to self, they actually do share some things in common, one of which is a desire for happiness and well-being.
Absolutely.
Even the negative entities have that same desire, but they take a more solipsistic approach to it than the positive polarity does. So I love that. I wanted to touch on too, you talked about the polarity again between fundamentalism and mysticism and how they're sort of opposites of each other. I also completely agree with you and think that's a very juicy topic in and of itself, because I think the lack of mysticism in organized Christianity is the main reason why it's been such a destructive force on planet Earth. Because any religion that's not, basically mystical at its core has really no other choice, right, than to devolve into a political ideology or a mindless sort of fundamentalism. And so I think one of the things that fundamentalism does is to make evil real, right? Make it a real second power. Satan is a real entity that exists and opposes God, like God's arch enemy or something. And there goes the devil running around in God's universe, foiling God's plans for salvation and sucking, 3/4 of God's children into hell forever. It's this really kind of cartoonish picture that you get. And yet when you're born into it, you're taught it every day from childhood. It just seems to make sense. But one of the things I like to do on my channel is unpack some of these theologies that fundamentalist religion has given to the world and show how totally ludicrous they are. One of which being the idea that people can reject God and choose hell.
Yes.
Because that's something, you'll classically hear religious people say, well, if you don't believe the Bible, if you don't believe this religion, then you're rejecting God. And I find that to be the most hilarious thing you could ever posit, I think, that you could reject the source of all being and the source of all happiness. It's like, if we all agree, Father Seán, that everybody wants to be happy and not suffer, and if we all agree, Christians alike would agree, God is the source of all happiness, and hell is kind of the epitome of all suffering. So then how can you also claim that people can reject God and choose hell? Like, how would that decision even play out? So I'd like to hear you say a few words about this idea that you can reject God, or that people reject God, and the way that religion creates that in and out sort of club atmosphere that makes makes room for words like heretics and blasphemy and all the separation terms that are used in religion. It really comes down to this idea that you either accept or reject God. And I find that to be personally a totally fallacious premise.
You're absolutely right. You can no more be separated from the love of God than, that sun rays can be separated from the sun. It's totally impossible. I can put up an umbrella and stop the sun from reaching me, but the sun is still there. So I can make decisions, where I don't experience the love of God. It doesn't mean that God has stopped loving me. As soon as I take away the umbrella, there it is, shining atop me again. So for every month, I take a theme for the homilies I give to my community. So for the month of August, I took as a theme the slippery slope from inspiration to inquisition. So I spent one Sunday looking at the ways in which we create sacred spaces. And then the second Sunday, I looked at the ways in which we corrupt sacred spaces. And yesterday I was trying to bring the two together. And so I'm looking at the various ways in which extraordinary religious, whether it's Judaism, Islam, Christianity, indigenous systems or whatever, the ways in which they've attempted to create sacred spaces. It could be, plant medicine. It could be sweat lodges. It could be the Latin masses with Gregorian chant and kind of extraordinary cathedrals with stained glass windows. So there are various ways in which we've learned how to create sacred spaces. But I remember reading a book some years ago called Zigzag Zen. I don't know if you came across it. It was written by, it was an anthology of interviews with Buddhist teachers, all of whom had been involved with psychedelic research in the 60s. And now they're Buddhist, and they've been asked, is there a discrepancy between them? And the thing I learned from that book was that there are four important, they call them the four S's. There's the kind of the set, the setting, the substance, and the sitter. So what is the mindset with which you want to take a journey? Is it I'm going to just have fun, or I want a spiritual experience? What is the setting? Is it at a rave with loud music and heavy metal, or is it in the mountainside? What is the substance? Is it ayahuasca? Is it peyote? Is it Eucharist? And finally, who's the sitter? Is there a shaman? Is there a priest? Is there a guide there? And that for me, that those four S's is really important. And I examined all the great wisdom traditions. I looked at Judaism, Islam, Christianity, and the indigenous population as well, and look at the ways in which they create sacred space. So that was the creation of sacred space. But then I looked at every one of them. What do you do when you've created an altered state of consciousness? What's the message that you implant in this? And unfortunately, that's where the fundamentalism takes over. So the message coming in the altered state of consciousness is fear and separation and hellfire and damnation, and war against the outsiders, inquisitions against the heterodox. So we package, we plant this vicious seed of separation, in this altered state that we spent so much time creating. And we've done this, in even indigenous societies, leading to kind of human sacrifice and stuff like that. So that for me is the journey. How do you create sacred space and infuse it with the realization that there is only God, there is only love? And you make sure that in interpersonal dynamics, that, once I create sacred space in my home or in my heart, I'm not filling it with fear or anxiety or anger against any group or any person, but that I'm cultivating the flower of the divine in my own self and in my communities. So it's a huge task for us. And I really believe that the salvation of the world consists not in changing political systems or economic models or educational systems. It is coming back to a kind of mystical core. And the good news is that even all these systems have still maintained a mystical core. Within Judaism, they managed to maintain a Kabbalah. Within Islam, Sufism. Within the American Native Indian tradition, extraordinary love for planet Earth, for nature. And within Catholicism, this kind of devotion to Mother Mary, to monasticism, and to kind of and mysticism. So that kind of that fire has been kept alive. In Ireland, when I was growing up as a kid in Ireland, the fire was never allowed to go out. There were houses in Ireland, literally, where the fire had not gone out for 300 years. So we used peat or turf. So at night, when everybody went to bed, the mother would gather all the embers and she'd cover them with ashes to protect them. And in the morning, she'd rake it out, and the glowing embers, she'd put more turf in it, and it would burst into flames. And so that the mystics of all traditions have been tending the embers of mysticism, even in the heart of cruel fundamentalist religious systems. And that's our job. That's your job right now, Aaron, in your podcasting and in your book, in your writing, whatever, to blow upon those embers, and to invite other people to add, peace to your fire.
Oh, so good, man. So good. I love your take on how religion, if it's anything, is really meant to be a place that creates a sacred space where people can come together to have the realization that there is only God, we are all one. That is what religion should be for. And, there are some spiritual groups and religious sects who do that pretty well. But for the most part, I think humanity has kind of failed on that end of religion up to this point. But to close us out, because the subtitle of this summit is Exploring the Mystical Teachings of Yeshua.
Brilliant.
Since you've touched on mysticism here for us, I think sometimes, especially myself as a spiritual teacher, like I can take for granted that people don't always know what these words mean, or like they sort of have an idea, but they don't really know what we mean or what you mean when you say mystical or mystic. So this is kind of a two-part question, but what is mysticism? How do you define mysticism? And then why do you believe that Jesus was a mystic?
Okay. Brilliant questions. So for me, when I define mysticism is this, that I think, we try to interpret teachings in many different ways. So very, very often when people listen to the teaching of Jesus or a teacher, they're kind of unpacking it literally. So it's a left brain activity, left cortex. So we're trying to make literal sense of it. And he's never talking at that level. Other people are hearing on the right-hand side, and it's more symbolic. But there's a difference between listening literally, listening symbolically, and listening mystically. So literal is about using the left brain, symbolic is about using the right brain, and mystical is about using the soul self. So I differentiate between wisdom and knowledge. For me, knowledge is data which are generated by the sensorium and processed by the brain, whereas wisdom is data which are generated by the soul and processed by the heart. And so even his own disciples listening to him, most of them thought it was ridiculous when he said, for instance, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you won't even have life. And you would say, oh, God Almighty, this is really crazy stuff. And we were told in John chapter 6, many people left and walked no more with him because they're listening with their left brain. So mysticism is the ability to listen with your soul, not with your brain, not to depend on the sensorium even. Yeah. And so Jesus then is a mystical teacher of mysticism. And there's a beautiful passage, two places in Matthew's Gospel in chapter 13, where the crowd are annoyed with him that he's always talking in parables. Why do you talk plainly to us, Speak theology, or philosophy, or science, or whatever. And he gives two different reasons. The first time he says, I speak in parables so that seeing you may see, but not understand, hearing you may hear, but not comprehend. So why would he say it in a way that they can see but not understand, hear but not comprehend? Because he's saying, you're only listening to me with your ears. If you're not listening with your soul, you're not going to get what I get.
Yeah.
And the second time he's asked, he says, I speak in parables so that I may reveal things which have been hidden since the foundation of the world. In other words, there are some truths which are so ineffable that the only way to articulate them is in some kind of a dramatic form. You can paint it, you can dance it, you can sing it, or you can tell stories about it. That's the only way you can introduce these kinds of topics. So that's precisely, so I invented a term years ago I call it mythish. And mythish is the articulation of sacred wisdom in story form. That the safest way to kind of encapsulate mystical teaching is mythology, some story, a story or a proverb. That stories are the archived wisdom of a culture. And if you want to understand the wisdom of a culture, go to their stories, not to their philosophy or their theology or their science, but to their stories. Yeah. So he was the ultimate teacher. And that was his shtick, telling stories.
Yeah. So he spoke to the souls of the people he was with, not just their brains.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And those who were in that space got it, and those who weren't just walked away.
Yeah. Yeah. Walked away as the rich man did, exactly. Sad and frustrated, right?
Yes, exactly.
So it sounds like you actually had a similar experience to Jesus from Matthew 10:18. The rich man says, good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Yeah. You sort of was it a Swahili tribe? Is that what you said?
Yes. Yeah. I actually worked with 3 different tribes there. Swahili was the national language, but then I was working with 3 other tribes as well. Yeah, Kipsigis, Nandi, and Tugan. So I was in 7 different missions over 14 years. Yeah. So I got to dig into the mythologies of the 4 different peoples. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so this group who had never heard of Jesus asked you essentially like, so according to this man, what must we do to inherit eternal life?
Right.
That's amazing, man. Yeah. It's like the Bible coming to life again.
Yeah. And saying to them, I remember as a young man when I was in high school, I was raised bilingually, Gaelic and English. And I would go to parts of Ireland where Gaelic was still the mother tongue. And summer holidays, I started collecting proverbs. In Gaelic, we call them Seán, which literally means ancient words. And I would go around to all the elders and say, can you give me a proverb and tell me in what context you'd use it? And I remember one old man saying to me, I collected 432 proverbs over the course of the summer. And I remember one old man saying to me, if Christianity had never come to Ireland, we could live according to the Proverbs. And he was absolutely right, that the wisdom of the Proverbs is extraordinary. And when I went to Kenya and I'm working with these people and I'm learning their mythology, I would say to them, if Christianity had never come to Africa, you could live according to your Proverbs. If you know how to work with your Proverbs, there's no truth, that you can't find in your own Proverbs, your own mythology. But you have to be listening with your soul and your heart. You can't just be listening with your ears. Because the object of any story is not information, it is transformation. That the great storyteller is somebody who can invite you to take your own surfboard and surf the waves. He'll prepare a framework, but your imagination is going to fill in all the pieces. And so I distinguish then between fantasy and imagination. Fantasy is the ability to make up stuff that's not real. Imagination is the ability to shift my state of consciousness, enter into different dimensions, encounter different entities and energies in those other dimensions, interact with them, learn from them, and then come back and cross-fertilize it on this side of the veil. So imagination is very different. So in imagination, you're doing the work. The storyteller is only giving you the surfboard. You have to surf yourself.
Yeah. Oh, so good, man. Wow. Well, Father Seán, this has been such a deep and rich conversation, as I knew it would be. Thank you so much for offering your time and your wisdom today. Please let us know, where can people find you, get involved with your community, anything you want to plug before we close?
Sure. So the website is spiritsandspacesuits.com. One word, spiritsandspacesuits.com. And so spiritsandspacesuits.com. And so all of the lectures I've done and books I've written, they're all up there. They're all freely available to anybody who wants. And there's a way of just connecting up. If you want to join any of our Sunday services, we just send you a link.
Okay, wonderful. Well, Father Seán, thank you again for joining us today, brother. It's been a true pleasure.
A million thanks. It's been a privilege to meet with you and to speak with you, Aaron.
Likewise.
Namaste, my brother.
Thank you all as well.
Okay.
Yeah, namaste. Thank you all for tuning in for this session of the Jesus Way Summit. I hope you were deeply blessed by it, as I truly was. And we'll see you guys on the next one. Peace and love.